Hey everyone, hi, it's really nice to see you all. Thank you for coming. For those of you, I think I know everybody, but in case I don't. My name is Christine Harold. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Communication. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our first colloquium of this academic year and the calendar year, Sally McMillan. So I'm going to introduce Sally and then I'll turn it over to her to engage us in what I think is going to be a really interesting conversation. So it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Sally J. McMillan, Professor Emerita of the University of Tennessee, where she served as a communication professor, department head, associate dean, and vice provost. Impressively, as if that wasn't impressive enough, Sally has navigated 8 careers so far. High school teacher, book editor, nonprofit leader, journalist, technology executive, university professor, academic administrator, and higher education consultant. And Sally earned her PhD from right here in the Northwest at University of Oregon. As a communication professor, Sally has taught advertising, media and management, public relations strategy and writing, and graduate seminars in communication theory and research methods. Her research focuses on defining interactivity, the history of digital media, online research methods, and the impacts of communication technology on organizations and society. So certainly topics that are of interest to all of us. She has published more than 150 articles in journals such as Journal of Advertising, Journalism, and Mass Communication, Quarterly, and New Media and Society. These days, Sally lives here in Seattle, where she contributes to the writers collective Post Alley. If you haven't checked it out, please do. Covering, among other topics, those squarely in what we might call the higher ed beat, including stories on recent challenges to university DEI initiatives, how women leaders negotiate careers in academia, the burdens of student loan debt, and upcoming renovations to UW's shell house of Boys in the Boat fame. And Sally herself is a rower, so a kind of girl in the boat, as well as an airline pilot. So I know. So please help me to welcome teacher, writer, and Renaissance woman, Dr. Sally McMillan, who will speak to us today about her latest book, Digital Immigrants and Media Integration. The Smartphone is the Synthesizer. Welcome, Sally.
I should qualify that I actually haven't flown an airplane for
quite a while, and I wouldn't flow one with the doors about to blow off, although I actually was in a plane one time when the door came up, and that's a whole other story. But I learned, after I learned to fly, and you do ground school and all that stuff, and they tell you there's 4 forces that make airplanes fly. In reality, it only takes 2 things to make a private airplane fly: time and money. And I've never seemed to be able to get to another place where I had both of those in balance to be able to fly. But it was a fun hobby for a while. Christine asked if there was anything novel that I should tell you, and that always seems to get a laugh. So we are going to be talking today about this book, Digital Immigrants and Media Integration, which is about smartphones. I'll warn you about that. But before I get into the book, I'd actually like to spend, I think we can do this, if everybody would spend a minute or less to just give me your 1-minute bio. I know mine was more than a minute, but just quickly tell me, if you're a student, what you're studying, if you're a faculty member, what you teach. And I'd also, and anything else, if you've got some point of pride, like being a rower or airplane pilot, I'd love to hear about it. But I'd also, I'd like to hear about the one best thing and one worst thing about your smartphone. All right, so who wants to start? Christine, let's start with you.
Okay. I'm Christine Harold. I'm a professor in the department. I study rhetoric and consumer culture, politics of consumerism, and smartphones. It is an incredibly handy device to have, Google in your pocket and your emails and your phone and all of the things. I think the downside for me is probably the same as it is for a lot of people. It can become, I catch myself kind of immediately going to it. I'm not a person who's on social media. I consume it, I don't post on it. So I have a weird relationship with social media. But I do catch myself sometimes in those down moments of just grabbing it and then stopping myself. I'm really practicing that right now.
Okay.
to not be mindless with it.
So I'm going to be a little random here about how I go around the table, but I'm going to do Kirsten next. Kirsten's the person in the room I've known the longest. She's traced it back to 1999, and I think she's right at a conference, but go ahead.
So I'm Kirsten Foote, I'm faculty in this department, and currently I'm leading a nonprofit organization called Businesses Ending Slavery and Trafficking. So countering human trafficking through employers. And everything is data. And maybe I'll write a book again about that someday. But in the meantime, it's just a lot of work. And it's hard to imagine functioning without a cell phone, but I remember, like when you and I met, I did not own a phone. I remember it was a year or two after I got my first one. It was like the size of a brick. And it is scary to me how much I need it now to function. There's something really unsettling. I need it, I appreciate it, and I'm unsettled by that.
Okay, great.
So actually, let's do the rest of this side of the table. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, I'm Amanda Frizz. I'm an assistant professor in the rhetoric area, and cell phone. Yeah. I also do remember getting my first cell phone when I was 16, and it was those Nokia ones that texting required like pressing the buttons multiple times to get the different letters. Yeah, I miss those days.
Candy bar phone.
The candy bar phones, yes. So these days my cell phone is where I keep all of my schedules and my tasks, and so it's my lifeline for my organization, like my organizational skills. But the thing I hate the most about it is all of the access. It feels like I'm Swiss cheese sometimes, that everyone can ping me through my phone at any time, and so the not having good boundaries on that access. That's what I hate the most.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Wang Beao. I am assistant professor here. I joined the department last year. I am more in the social scientific approach, and I study and teach social interactions in the context of group and interpersonal relationship. So interpersonal kind of group conflict in that sense.
Great.
For smartphone, well, what to say that I feel like this is pretty much a important entry point of me and anything else. I'm kind of introvert, but I do have a long distance relationship, so I chat a lot. I checked I recently upgraded my Apple storage just because my iMessage with my partner, just grew so much. Like it's like 10 gigabytes now through the past 7 years. So yeah, I feel like that's my media to my partner. And also what I don't like is that I do get addicted recently, well not recently, to short video like TikTok and yeah, I hate it. I really hate it, but it's very
right? Let's go to Nick.
Thanks. Hi everyone, Anis Raman here. I'm a teaching faculty. I just came late from finishing the COM 200, the introduction course. I write about global media. So what I like about my phone is that my kids play with a lot. They film each other. They film our whole family activities, and that's fun to rewatch. And I talk to my mom, who is in Bangladesh, using video chat app, which really feels good when I am able to do that. But also it's an app that, lots of apps that actually takes my time, like emails, Messenger, Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram more recently. So that's why I later regret that I could have spent that time with my kids when I'm on my phone. Yeah, that's what I dislike about it, that not being able to control the time.
Interesting. All right, let's go over here to against the wall. Start that in. Yeah.
I'm Hao Mingling. I'm a first year MBA student here, and I aim to study the dynamics in online discourse and topics, discourse styles. About smartphone, I think Professor Rahman just reminded me of something like taking photos. I do like using smartphones to take photos because it's very handy. Like whenever I find something beautiful, I just use my smartphone to take a photo. I think that's something that I really likes. And for the downside, I think smartphone for me is kind of like when I want to have a rest, I can to my smartphone for a resort, but I will go to my resort too far away, and then time passes so fast. That's kind of the downside.
Keep track of how many times time comes up. Okay, go ahead.
Hi,
Yes.
my name is Ran Tong. I'm also a first year graduate student here. I study feminist. My research focus on feminist studies and communication technology. My favorite thing about my phone is probably Apple Pay, because I don't have to carry my credit cards everywhere wherever I go. One thing that I don't like is probably like Professor wants a. Yeah, I also have a problem of addiction on social media, which I'm working on.
Okay, great.
My name is Russell Hansen. I am a PhD candidate here in the Department of Communication. I study online political discussion and public deliberation. And my favorite thing about my cell phone is that I have advice and guidance and information on tap. So not just stuff that I can look up on Google, but like I can see what people have said about it. I can see what the arguments are, and I can kind of weigh the discourse. And kind of similar to Kirsten, I also don't like that I have a dependency on it. There's a need, which I recently experienced coming here as my phone died on the train, realizing like, how am I going to entertain myself on the way back? The trains aren't coming as often. I'm looking at the maps on the wall. What do I do?
Yeah, chill. Okay.
Hi, my name is Megan Dahl. I'm also a PhD candidate here in the department. I study news and public opinion, especially media trust in strong state environments. And I think my favorite part about my phone is the camera. I like to take a lot of photos. And I think the worst part for me personally is that I break them like a lot. Like I find them a bit fragile, and these days they're so expensive, and so it's like high consequence when you break the screen or drop it in a lake or like what have you.
Hi everyone, my name is Amir Perez. I'm in the communications major. My favorite thing about my phone is that it's always with me. That's also like the bad thing about my phone. That's always.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay, let's go.
Hi, I'm Dave. I met got here and now just under Books and now I'm in the master's program. My favorite thing about my smartphone is Professor I get to connect to my family 1,000 miles away. But lately I've been noticing that I can't see without watching lots of videos, so I don't like that. And to work on it.
Okay, good. No,
Hi everyone, I'm Mariam. I basically moved here from Norway, where I was a journalist.
I'm so serious.
Women's issues. And I'm a graduate student here at the Communication and Leadership Masters. And the favorite thing about my phone is that I'm connected to my family in a different continent. With 9 hours time difference. Worst thing about it is that I'm getting addicted to it, not only in looking at social media, but also, especially in Norway, you have to have it to take public transportation, and so the whole society is shifting to having to have that device. So.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and it's one that comes up some in the book. And for me, when I realized that you couldn't live in Seattle without it, it's for parking, right? You can't park without a smartphone. You can't pay to park.
I was having lunch with a colleague of ours and paid for parking right in the middle of the lunch.
Yeah.
And how many times have we needed to pay for something and we have to download the app first and we're trying to catch the train and we're trying to catch the bus. My name's Anita, I teach in the Comedy program, and I think one of my favorite things about my smartphone is I always have something to read. I always, and it's less heavy than the tomes that I'm sometimes carrying around. So I love that, if I have connectivity and as Russell's saying, I've got charge. What I dislike most about the phone, let's see, I used to pride myself in my sense of direction. Google Maps is maybe the dumbest navigator. I can't stand it. I appreciate it, but there's a sacrifice in terms of my acuity, in terms of navigation. Okay. I'm not as observant.
I'm Madison. I'm a staff member in the department. I would say one of the things that I like the most about my smartphone is that I can like download so many songs because I love music, and I'm so glad that like I don't have to have my like CD holders anymore. You know, you can flip through. And so
Try LP records, it's even worse.
And so I think I might have an addiction to downloading music though, because I recently found I had 90 gigabytes on my phone. But then something that I dislike is, like Professor Chris said, like I am just available all the time. And so, you know, sometimes I just, like on the weekends, I won't check my phone, and that really irritates my mom when she's trying to call me.
Okay.
Hello everyone, my name is Elisa. I am Madison student assistant. I'm a third year majoring in biochemistry. Something that I like about my phone is that FaceTime is available, so I can FaceTime my family whenever I want. Something that I don't like is that I'm very dependent on it. It's the first thing I look at when I wake up, and it's the last thing I see before I go to sleep. So.
Yeah. All right. Back in the corner. I know you guys are doing media, but go ahead and tell us about yourself. Go ahead.
You wanna go first, Megan?
Hi, my name is Megan. I'm a fourth year undergraduate student in the department, and I'm also a core intern. And I'd say my favorite thing about having a phone is being able to be in contact with people, because you can just easily text them. It's easy to reach people. But I think my least favorite part is probably kind of like related to what Madison said, like being available all the time, and it can be overwhelming, like getting a lot of notifications from different platforms, different people, like on social media, emails, messages, and that kind of thing.
Gotcha. I'm Tommy, staff member doing the recording. Favorite thing about my smartphone would have to be podcasts. I am obsessed, especially with like the wireless headphones now getting super good. It's like, doesn't matter what you listen to, it's always going to be great. Least favorite, I think partly for me because of my schedule, like texting courtesy and like times and like when people expect to hear back from me on certain things. I'm like, we live in very different worlds, right? And so that's kind of a miscommunication thing with smartphones. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So this book is about digital immigrants, and you might be saying, what is a digital immigrant? Well, we've probably all heard the term digital native, but the two terms actually were both sort of coined at about the same time by the same guy, Robert Prinsky, his name is, and I'm trying to remember, it was in the early 2000s, I believe, that he started using the term. It's in here somewhere, but it was a while ago. But we hear a lot more about digital natives than we do about digital immigrants. I defined for this book digital immigrants as people who were born before 1969, was kind of an arbitrary cut date. I had some reasons for it, and who use a smartphone now for at least one thing. They don't have to be an expert user, but they need to use it for at least one thing. So I'm betting that there are not very many digital immigrants in this room. All right, we got one. Got it? We got anybody else?
In 69.
In 69, we'll give it to you. Anybody else? All right, well, I am firmly, I was born in 1956, so I've got you. My reason for that was that I wanted people who had come to full adulthood, who had graduated, or if they went to college, had graduated from college potentially, before smartphones were introduced. So I wanted people who had experienced coming of age without this technology. And the book is, just briefly, I'll tell you where the book came from. It partly comes from my own experience. Because I am a digital immigrant. And I'm somebody who's studied media technology for a while, although that was, I'd done a bunch of other stuff first, including working for tech companies. In fact, the company I worked for most immediately before I went back to graduate school was a modem manufacturer. Anybody remember modems? Yes. So I knew, and so I went back to school in '94. The first web browser was introduced in '93. And I knew that this was about to become a major force. Didn't know exactly how it was going to evolve, but I decided rather than figuring out how to market the next product, I wanted to be in a position where I could look at the bigger picture. I also can almost always win the contest of who's been online the longest because my father was a research physicist. So he had access to DARPA way before any of the rest of us knew anything about what an internet was. And I didn't really understand what we were doing, but in the 1970s, he got my brother and I online playing an online text-based game called Zork, which was kind of a precursor to Dungeons and Dragons, if you can believe it. So there I was in 1973 or 74 online and didn't even know what I was doing. But we had a modem. It was the old kind where you take the phone and you plug it into a pair of ears. And it was very slow and we had no screen. It was just a thermal printer and a keyboard and you played a game. So it's something that's been in my life for a very long time. Also, I had done some previous studies that were looking at sort of generational issues and differences related to technology use. So I'd done a study of Gen X, young people, who came of age with the internet, so a little bit younger, but didn't have it when they were very young, but mostly got it when they were in middle school maybe, or and so looking at how they had made the transition, I found that interesting. I had also done a study of senior citizens and how they used digital technologies, particularly for health communication, which is a subset of my research interests. So I started this book in 2019. Actually, I may have started in late 18, but in that time frame. Anyway, pre-COVID, that's the important thing. And the book started because the International Communication Association was scheduled to hold its next conference in Australia, and I wanted to go. And I needed a piece of research to be able to have a conference paper, to be able to go to Australia. So I thought, what would I like to write about? And I was at I was near the end of my academic career and sort of looking back at things that I had done, and I thought, this is an interesting piece that builds on quite a few of the things that I've done, and I'm just not seeing much about it in the literature. So I think I'll do a set of in-depth interviews with people who meet this criteria and find out about their internet use. You know what happened to that conference. It got canceled. But the paper got accepted, and as happens at academic conferences, book editors sort of swarm around looking at interesting conference titles. And someone from Rowman Littlefield, Lexington Books contacted me and said, I'm really interested in your study. And she said, I think it would make an interesting book-length project. Are you interested in it? And my response was, no. I didn't get to go to Australia. I don't care anymore. But then I retired and realized that I still was interested in the subject, and I had a lot more time than I knew what to do with. So I decided, yeah, I'll do it. I'll spend some more time. So I actually went back post-COVID and did follow-up interviews with all the people who I'd talked to previously. So let me start. I'll tell you a little bit more about both theory and method, but let me start with a story, because this book is based on the stories. It's based on the stories of people that I interviewed and their experiences. So remember, these are all people who were born, fundamentally they're all baby boomers, right? So they're people who came to adulthood without this technology. So this is actually the opening story in the book. Randy and her husband, a busy young couple, needed multiple items from multiple stores. With small children at home, they rarely had a chance to run errands. Finally, they arranged a date night, and Randy's mother came to watch the kids. Before going to dinner, Randy's husband dropped her off at the shopping mall, then drove to the hardware store. They thought they had agreed on a time and place to meet. After they had both waited for the other for several minutes, they realized they had miscommunicated. We didn't know where the other person was, and we didn't know how to solve that dilemma. So we ended up using a payphone. I called my mom. I said, I don't know if Daniel's going to call you, but here's where I am, and I have no idea where he is. My recollection is that he did the same thing, and we finally got together somehow. Randy told her grandchildren about this experience that happened in the 1980s. They didn't understand why their grandparents hadn't texted each other, and the concept of a payphone was completely foreign to them. Anybody ever seen a payphone? Used a payphone? Yeah. I actually saw one on Whidbey Island the other day, and I went over and picked it up, and it was live. It's like, whoa. I thought it was just a museum piece. So, this being able to connect with each other and being, I said to remember time because, and I'll come back to it again, but being, they'd arranged a time. They thought they'd arranged a time to meet, but when it didn't work, they didn't have an easy way to communicate outside of being in the same place at the same time or figuring out how to use the technology they had to sort of jury-rig things. I could tell a lot of stories about being lost, not being able to find people without a smartphone, and I suspect some of you probably have memories of that experience as well. But the theoretical underpinning of the book really goes back primarily to Harold Innis, who, anybody read Innis? A couple of people, all right. Innis is not particularly popular anymore. He wrote mostly in the 40s and 50s. He was a Canadian political economist. His work is difficult. I'm not going to lie to you. Reading Innis is not, for the faint of heart. Partly because he was writing at a different time and place, and partly because it was a very different style of writing that he was doing. A lot of reference to classical material that many of us don't study anymore. But he had several interesting ideas, but one core idea that I kind of focused on in this book was he has the premise that all media, in fact, he has a book that's titled The Bias of Communication. And his premise is that all media are biased, either toward time or space. And from his perspective, time-based media focus on building community, while space-based media focus more on control. So I'll provide a couple of examples in a minute. He's a Canadian, did most of his work at the University of Toronto, which is probably another reason he's not studied a lot in this country because, what do they know, eh? Right? But he did have a very famous Canadian follower. Follower is not quite the right word. I'm not going to say student because they didn't really, McLuhan didn't study under Innis, but they were both in Canada. And they were both, Innis came first, McLuhan came shortly thereafter, and built on some of the ideas that Innis had introduced. Now, whereas Innis was incredibly thick and difficult, McLuhan, his goal was to make everything, exotic and easy, right? So, his most famous, Marshall McLuhan is best known for is his idea that the media is the message, or the medium is the message. And so, out of both of their work, there has grown to be a school of communication thought that's sometimes called media ecology. I would argue that what Innis and McLuhan were doing was larger than what the media ecologists have sort of evolved into. But I think that they provide an interesting foundation for thinking about a medium that has been transformational in our lifetimes. And I also spent time reading Jim Carrey, not the comedian, the communication scholar, who wrote about many things. But one of the things he did was really try to explicate Innis and McLuhan and compare and contrast, and what can we learn from them. Now, Carrey was again a little bit later, but for Innis, radio was new media. For McLuhan, television was new media. And Carrey was writing a little bit later. We really hadn't transitioned to any, broad-scale digital media yet, but he was reflecting on television a little bit later than McLuhan does. McLuhan was still very, upbeat that this was going to be we were going to create global villages with this medium, and it was going to, make us all it was going to be community building as well as highly engaging. Carrie sort of takes their ideas and also uses a historian's lens rather than a political economist's lens or a sort of pop media culture kind of lens to look at media. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. But yeah, so in terms of method then, I conducted in-depth interviews with 16 people who all met the qualification of being digital immigrants. It was a snowball technique that I used for gathering my sample. Started with a few people I knew and asked them to make recommendations. And I specifically, as the study progressed, I pushed to try to push to the edges of the sample, right? So I didn't want everybody who used their smartphone in the same way, or everybody who was comfortable about their smartphone in the same way. So I would ask somebody, do you know somebody who has a smartphone but who's not real comfortable with it, or hasn't used it very long? Or do you know somebody who is way more, engaged with their smartphone, doing a lot of different kinds of things that you don't do? So trying to, push the edges. Now, Kirsten and I were just having a little conversation a minute ago about qualitative samples and what's enough, but fortunately for this project, that was not a big question this time. I did feel like after 16 interviews that I had reached a point where I was hearing a lot of the same things, and I was starting to identify some themes that seemed to be consistent across the interviews. So I stopped. But I did go back to those same 16 people for the second round of interviews, and it was fortunate that I had a relatively small sample and was able to get them all to respond again. I also did some autoethnography of my own media use because, as I told you, I've been a digital media user for a long time. So I shared some of my own experiences. And I also did some historical work, mostly from secondary sources, so not sort of deep historical work. But as themes began to emerge about sort of the technologies that these people had used over their lifetimes, I was able to sort of, and this is not rocket science, but it became clear that we're talking about talking and writing and pictures were the primary modes of communication that came up over and over again in these conversations. So I did some historical tracing of how we have gotten to the place that we are with things like cameras, for example, or audio recording, and some of the, and even cellular technology, sort of tracing some of that history as well. And then also what became clear as the interviews continued was that there were three primary functions that people were using their media for. Again, both pre and post digital media. So again, when I was interviewing these people, I was asking them not just about how do you use it now, but what was your life like before you had it and how has it changed over time? And they came up with three big functions that I also examined from a little bit of a historical perspective as well, looking at transitions. So one is about keeping connected, search and navigation, so to be able to get to where you need to go, and then commerce and commercials. So those were the three big functional areas that I looked at and sort of traced how we got there historically. So I am going to be asking you for more input in just a minute. But let me share one more quote from the book. So why focus on digital immigrants? So Prinsky, and here we go. It was 2001 when Prinsky identified digital natives and digital immigrants as being two different ways of engaging with digital media. So Prinsky notes that as digital immigrants learn to adapt to their environment, they always retain, to some degree, their accent, that is, their foot in the past. That foot in the past has been shown to have advantages. For example, digital immigrants are better able to apply knowledge and to critically weigh risks and benefits of digital transactions that are younger generational cohorts. The heavy accent that digital immigrants retain can also mark them as being from the old world and make it difficult for them to fully acculturate to the changing communication landscape. My smartphone is always with me, but I use it with a digital immigrant's accent. And even though I've been researching technology and engaged with technology for a very long time, I know that I do not have the same level of fluency that most of you do, because I speak with an accent, a digital immigrant's accent. So I will give you a couple of examples for me. The first is I'm making a presentation without any digital presentation material. Now, I chose that, and I actually talked to Christine about it. It's like, you know, I've taught with PowerPoint for decades, and I've recognized the value of it as a tool, but I thought, you know, I want to talk about this. And it's easier for me to talk if I don't have the technology in front of me. So that's one example. Another example is when I'm working on a writing project, most writing projects, not always, especially now that I'm doing some journalism, but most of the time, if I'm working on a book or an article, I feel like I have to have a printed copy to do my final edit. I can't do my final edit on the screen. I can't see the mistakes. So my question to you, and since most of you are digital natives, and that's good, but from both of those of you who are digital natives and those of you who are immigrants, what do you see, and I'm just going to throw this open for just a couple minutes of quick conversation, what do you see as the biggest differences between people who fundamentally have had this technology most of their lives and those of us who didn't? Yeah.
An example from my daily life is every time I FaceTime my grandparents, every single time I have to explain them how to open the device so that I can see them and they can see me. Mm-hmm. Every time.
Every time, yeah. And how old are they? They're probably my age, yeah.
80, 90.
Okay, a little older, but yes, yes. My husband's 92. It's never going to happen for him without somebody else there to do it for him. Yeah. No, you.
I'm thinking about whether it's the tweaking, the ability to stick with it, that it's going to work out if you just apply, that there's perhaps that the fuse is shorter, or the throwing the hands up comes faster to those who weren't swimming in it from a certain age. And so that there seems to be a greater tolerance for, I'm going to be able to figure this out because apps have similarities, or phones across different services have similarities, and that the frustration level comes faster to those of us that are raised with it. Okay.
Anybody who's younger want to, well, we did have one from a younger, yeah, somebody else, go ahead. Yep, you. Mm-hmm.
I actually don't have what I'm trying to say is, I actually don't know. I can't imagine that. I was thinking about maybe those digital immigrants, they are more likely to get addicted to TikTok. But then I thought about my parents, they, or more or less, right? I thought that my mom kind of not really get into it, but my dad got very addicted, so I think that doesn't fit. So maybe that's the problem of being a digital native, that I can't even imagine.
Can't even imagine what it's like. Yeah, interesting. Anybody else?
Well, one thing that Anita was talking about resonates for me. I think we're approximately the
Yeah,
same age.
I'm 70, I barely.
Yeah.
So I do remember the glory days where I didn't have.
Yeah, I mean, I was well into.
I
was fully baked human being by the time the
sure.
smartphones came. Yeah,
for sure.
But I think but I have 3 teenagers, and so I think there's this phenomenon for me of, I get exhausted, I won't stick with trying to solve a problem, and I also have this sense that like my reality is outside the phone, and if I and I'll get fatigued by being inside the phone for too long, and I just need to separate. So like I have to read a book at the end of the day, not be on the phone until bed, right? Because like I need that separation. It feels like I'm going back to my real self. Whereas I don't think my oldest daughter, we've been really slow to let them have phones actually. But my oldest, I think for her it's like the in the phone world is the real world.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
It's all her world.
And I'll add to that I think that there's, I perceive qualitative differences that feel more native, right? When I'm with people, friends, we're in media-free environment, and we all intentionally like put phones away, we're outside, we're doing something, and that to me is like, oh yeah, this is real connection. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just curious, any of the younger folks want to push back against that? Yeah.
I don't want to push back. I actually just maybe offer the same thing from a different perspective. I think like I grew up where like my first access to the internet was about 5, 6, which means that like there was a brief period where like I really wasn't plugged in. But I think like that made me all the more like want that connection to what was going on in the world all the time, like a TV in my room, access to the internet as soon as I had it. So I think it's like I can feel the sense that like when I don't have the connection, something's missing, like a crucial resource, almost biologically. Like I need to be hooked back in. I can wait a while. I like it if I wait a while, but like I can only go 3 days without water. You know?
Good analogy. I like that. All right, let me share one more quote. And this one's the first one that I gave you was from near the beginning of the book, talking about digital immigrants. But at the end, after we've had all these interviews and conversations and you know drawn inferences, I come back to this question of why focus on digital immigrants? Why is it important? Digital immigrants are in a unique position to offer insight on being human in the digital world. So, because of the full pre-digital lives they led, they are aware that there are many ways to communicate. They have talked on landline phones, written postcards, watched TV shows at fixed times, dropped in on neighbors without texting first, looked things up in a dictionary, and shopped at the mall. They can find their way in the world even when they are lost in Rome without a GPS. They also know that smartphones can make all these things easier. Digital immigrants are aware that they have choices and have learned how to be selective in their digital communication. Because they have lived through periods of transition, they have learned to use many different types of interfaces and often approach their choice of interfaces thoughtfully rather than instinctively as a digital native might. They think about when it might be best to talk face-to-face rather than send a text and vice versa. So all of those little anecdotes were things that came from the interviews. The story about being lost in Rome without a GPS was particularly amusing. They forgot to plug their phone in when they landed. And
they went out to explore the city, and sure enough, phone had juice, and they had to figure out how to get back to their hotel. So we can all do it. We can survive without these for the most part, at least for now. But I think that one of the things that I came away with is that I think many of these digital immigrants are their problem-solving skills. The dependency issue. Several of you mentioned dependency issues. Very much aware that they're very highly dependent on their phone, but they also feel like they have a certain set of problem-solving skills that they learned before they adopted digital technology, which they're able to fall back on as when they need to. Any general comments before I move on into a little bit more of the meat of some of the findings? Yeah.
Just a very good question. So I was just curious about what is the education level of, maybe that's something you would get into, of the interviewee.
Sure. So again, I tried to get a dispersion. So I didn't want to interview all college professors. In fact, I didn't interview any of my colleagues, but I did end up with a couple of people who were professors at other institutions who got referred to me by other people. So it's I was intentionally trying to get breadth of educational background, work experience, and so forth. So it was a range. Not all college educated, all did have at least a high school education. And they were working in a variety of jobs, from facilities maintenance to, I don't want to make it like a hierarchy, but a variety of jobs, job types. Anything else? Yeah.
Do you see a difference, a meaningful difference between a medium and a technology?
Good question. I'm not sure. I think it depends on how we're defining medium, right? What do we mean when we say medium? To McMillan, the medium is the message, right? So, and for him, it was very discreet. This is television, and this is how we engage with television. But I think, and actually we'll maybe come back to this a little bit later, this gets to the subtitle of the book, the smartphone is the synthesizer, right? So everything is here now, right? We don't have visual media versus text media anymore. We don't have, moving images versus still images anymore. It's all right here. So is this a medium? Is it a technology? Yes. What's the difference between the two? It's a good question. I'm not really sure. Does that answer?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else?
All right. So I said that the first half of the book really focuses on communication forms. So oral communication, text communication, and visual communication, basically. So I'll talk about those a little bit in the context of sort of the theoretical underpinning of the book. There's also, a lot of the kind of stories and history and so forth in that section, but I thought this would be a place to sort of show how it ties back. So Ennis really idealized oral communication. He believed that it was the quintessential community building form of communication, and he was not opposed to other forms, but he saw it as being sort of at the very core of communication. McMillan, on the other hand, saw oral communication as being cool. And for him, hot is better than cool, right? So I know in idiom that's not necessarily true, but that there were not a lot of ways to engage other than simply listening and speaking.
It was not, to use a term that I've troubled over for many years, it's not, you're not interacting with the medium, you're interacting with the individual, right? So, but he saw it as being sort of an idealized form of communication. Ennis saw radio as, and again, remember when he's writing, 1940s primarily, into the early 50s, so he was aware of television, but it had not had any kind of widespread distribution. So he saw radio as the ultimate in time-biased, control-focused communication. So as you read Ennis's histories, he sort of starts with oral communication as this idealized form of communication, traces communication history, and seeing it over time become less and less focused. And the way he uses time and space is complicated. So I'll just sort of not try to get too deeply into it here. But that it went from being time biased to space biased, and that every new media innovation made things more space biased. And really, it's about, to him, a space biased communication medium or tool is designed to facilitate administrative control over broad distances. And so he believed that that radio had helped Hitler win World War II,
and that radio had helped Roosevelt stay in power. And he saw those as examples of the sort of what he would call space binding characteristics of radio. McMillan saw television as the ultimate in hot, engaging media and believed it had the power to both amuse and to build global villages. Again, he started writing about television early on when there was still a whole lot of optimism. He did change his tune a little bit later, some. But then Carey, actually, a really interesting piece that I found that Carey wrote about the telegraph. And he made an interesting point that I had not thought about previously, which is that the telegraph was really the first communication technology that enabled a message to be received before the messenger. And so he talked a lot about sort of that, what that transition meant. And he also talked about how in the early days of telegraphy, it actually, so thinking about it in terms of space and time, so now we have this medium that can get there, it can get to a different place at a time that's faster than the person who's bringing the message or sending the message. But the early technology actually, if you look at where telegraph lines were laid, they were along the same lines as canals and railways and roads, although roads weren't much at the time, because those were the mechanisms for moving things. And so we're moving communication now, but we still think of it almost in the same way that we think about moving things. And it wasn't until radio when we broke free from that, right? Because now the radio signals are no longer tied to going through wires, which are then laid next to roads and railroads and canals because they were, and telegraph initially was very much in service of the railroads. It was, without it, it would have been very difficult to do transcontinental rail traffic, and he provides some interesting examples of, and it's partly because of time, both time and space, right? So we think today of time zones as being somehow, part of the geography. They're not. Prior to the telegraph, the time was based on, it's noon here because the sun is directly overhead. And so clocks were actually set based on local solar phenomena. Well, if you're trying to move people and goods across the country and trying to tell them when the train is going to arrive and make sure that trains don't run into each other, you need to standardize time. So the standardized times as we know them are really sort of a phenomena that came after telegraphy and were driven largely by the railroads. So again, that's just a really brief overview. There's a lot more in here about sort of the transitions in oral communication, written communication, and visual communication that have happened in the lifetimes of these participants. But thinking about it in the sort of theoretical terms, it's clear that some of those distinctions, and I think this maybe gets back to your question, is it Amanda, is that right? That Ennis and McMillan and Carey were still thinking about media as being very discrete, and each of them having their own characteristics. But as we've moved into this kind of synthesis, how does that change our understanding of, and we can call it time and space bias, we can call it community versus control sort of intent of the message. But I guess the question that I drafted was, how has the smartphone made communication more integrated rather than biased? Because remember, Ennis's central principle is that all media are biased toward one set of outcomes or another, and more focused on synthesizing rather than differentiating media types. And I realize I've probably just embedded the answer in the question, but any thoughts about that concept? Do you think when you're using your smartphone, do you think, oh, I'm going to do something visual now? Or I'm going to do something oral now? Or I'm going to, we do talk about texting, and we still think about texting as being we use the term text to refer to a very specific activity, which actually, interestingly, and this came up over and over again in the book, as we age, and neither our fingers nor our eyes work as well as they used to, we engage with this device a little bit differently. So I text a lot, and most of the time I'm talking to my phone. So it's oral communication and text communication all wrapped up in one, and it's directly with a device rather than an individual. Although when you're talking to people in Norway, at the same, it's 9 hours different, but you're talking in real time for both of you. It sort of makes some of that, the distance kind of changes. So.
Question kind of along the lines of what you're I think part of what you're asking, and it seems like part of it has to do with the fact that everything now has been digitized, right? So there used to be film and vinyl, and like there were different media, like literally different materialities to the media. And now, whether it's a picture, a video, or a sound, or words, it's all digitized. And so I feel like there's more opportunity for control. Mm-hmm. There's also more opportunity for access, potentially. I mean, so I don't know, I'm just curious what because that seems to me a key piece of the shift between the generations and the things that you're looking at.
You're absolutely right. And as I was talking with the digital immigrants and thinking about this myself as well, most of us experienced digital before we experienced digital mobile. So I refer to these throughout the book as being digital mobile devices. So, I had my first computer, about 1983, probably. Even before that, I was using some technologies that were digital and didn't really, when landline phones became digital, most of us didn't really realize what had happened, but it did fundamentally shift the way we use the phone. Not only did you not dial anymore, you used a touch tone, but it was the medium felt the same, but it had become digital. So there was, for most of these people, experienced multiple kinds of transitions. Somebody mentioned CDs. CDs are a transitional technology. They were digital, but they were embedded in a physical object that you carried with you, right? And that's very different. It's a step along the way, but it's different from streaming, right? It's different from being, and we also talked some about books and, you need to read a book before you go to bed at night. I also often read myself to sleep, but I read digitally because I have an iPad next to my bed, which is also my alarm clock, and my digital reader, and I can make the type as big as I want, so I can fall asleep without having to have my glasses on, right? To be able to read. So.
Building off of that, one of the things that I was struck by when you first had the prompt and we went around the room, one of the things that I like least about the phone, and this gets to that idea of what do we mean by text, is that when email first started, my father would print out, he's a historian, he would print out all of our correspondence because he wanted to make sure there was going to be something tactile. Now we have an active family thread, and it vaporizes. It's gone. And there's something profoundly sad to me about that. That it is a. But yet, I think for a younger generation, you wouldn't expect if you ran into somebody on the quad that conversation goes away. But I still occupy a space generationally where I feel that as a loss. It's text. We are writing to each other, but it's gone.
Yeah.
And I think, and so that it
because
makes me.
The fundamental thing about text, even all the way to Plato, right, was like the upside of text is that it allows ideas to go over across space and time, but the downside to text is it allows ideas to go across space and time, right? But now we have, but we have this sense of like it's ephemeral, and text isn't
Very
supposed to be
ephemeral.
ephemeral.
I know, so I feel like this dissonance every day, even if it's, I can't even put my finger on it, but it's just, I feel like I'm in this perpetual state of, like, just subtle grief.
Yeah. You know, one of the participants in this piece talked about that extensively, and she was married to a historian and had a little bit of historian sort of blood in her as well. And she talked about how she misses the, you know, the boxes of cards that she used to get at Christmas time. You know, she would keep them all in a shoebox. And now, you know, people, if they send any kind of holiday greeting at all, it's you know, digital.
But I feel like the number of cards I get has gone up in the last 4 or 5 years because of how now seamless it is with our phones to send, you know, to use Minted or Shutterfly. And so I actually think that I've noticed a change, that there's now it's facilitated in a way that I'm getting more holiday physical cards than I did 7 years ago.
Yeah, there's a nostalgia for it.
Yes.
Yeah. It's the same. It's probably the same impulse that's bringing back LPs.
And tabletop games.
And tabletop games. Yeah. Yes.
So hopefully this is not deviating from what is currently discussed. I'm curious about your thought about how researchers should approach technology. I'm curious about your thinking because what you have been discussing kind of occurred to me, kind of reflect this change of research focus within like communication and technology research. You know, people used to focus on technology features or different types of medias. Then there was a period of time, you know, there was this affordance thing that we talk about affordance. But then what are the affordances? That becomes murkier and murkier. So I was wondering if you have any advice, you know, where should we look at when we try to understand information and communication technology?
Well, I think, you know, this is a little bit of a cop-out answer, but it's always the right answer. It depends on the research question. You know, so what is it that you want to know? And if it is a particular affordance or characteristic of a particular kind of technology, then perhaps it needs to be examined from that perspective. But if what you're really interested in, and I know several of you indicated you're interested in small group or interpersonal communication. I mean, if what you're really interested in is how a family communicates, then it's less important to look at the difference between a text message and a WhatsApp and a holiday card than it is to think about what are the underlying factors that drive family communication.
So I'd like to add that, you know, one thing I get from these kind of thinking is that usually at the end of the day, you will be thinking that eventually people will be able to adapt. And what are inherent to human in terms of how we communicate interpersonally, in group or family, will basically controls how we use media. And eventually, you know, technology becomes invisible and transparent. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really change. So of course, you would hope that technology would change how we organize our family, you know, how we talk interpersonally. Maybe it is, but then from a research point of view, I feel like at the end of the day, it becomes like invisible.
Right, because it's been all synthesized down to this.
So does that mean that there is no need to understand technology, no need to study technology? But that sounds quite, problematic.
Yes.
And I'm not quite sure that I don't know what the answer is. I'll be honest. You know, when I started a PhD program in 1994 and told my advisor I wanted to study the internet, he's like, "What?" I mean, we were just barely doing email, and he said, "Isn't it just, you know, the best that most people could understand, including myself, because, you know, it was evolving. It was still it was a baby. But the best we could understand was that it was digital, and it was, you know, back then we called it the World Wide Web. You know, this notion that it was global, that it was that it was multimedia, the very concept of being, having multiple media types all wrapped up in one was still pretty new. I was planning to teach advertising public relations, and he says, he said, given your background, because I'd been, whatever, it doesn't matter, but he says, you should be studying media, you should be studying media buying, and, what are the models for enhancing, media effectiveness? And I'm like, fortunately, he was flexible and let me study the internet, but he actually did say at one point, it's just a flash in the pan, you're going to be sorry. But actually, he did have one point that I think he was very right about, and I think it relates to what you're saying. He said, you need to understand, you don't want to spend too much time focusing on a specific technology. You need to understand what are the larger issues, the bigger implications, right? So if back in 1994 I decided I was going to do an in-depth study of MySpace to really understand what MySpace was and how it was different from other, instances of communication on the World Wide Web, it wouldn't have lasted very long, right? So I think it's a little bit of both. But I think we do have to recognize that the technology has changed things. And it has changed, and this is the reason I like Ennis as a core theoretical underpinning here. It has changed the way we relate to space and time. And I think it has enabled us to do community building at a distance, and it's also enabled us to think about control in different ways as well. So if you take, if instead of saying time and space, you say community versus control, and think about media differences or similarities and how that's all come together. I don't know if that answers. Well, let's move on and talk for just a minute about communication functions. So I told you at the start that identified the three ways of communicating, and then the three functions. So the first was keeping connected. And what I'm going to do for each of these is again, because this book is a book based on stories, I'm going to share a story, something that was shared by one of the participants for each. And then I'd like for us to just spend a minute or two thinking about each in the context of time and space, and control and community and heat as well, to use McLuhan's term. Engagement, how much do these, has the way that we engage around these functions shifted? So keeping connected. I thought about doing a whole chapter on social media, but this gets back to your point. I think that it's not really about social media, it's about being connected, right? So how has that shifted over the lifetimes of these digital immigrants? So one of them said, I think it's sort of two-pronged. I think it's shrunk space a lot because I can text my daughter-in-law in Arkansas and say, what size Cinderella costume should I get my granddaughter for Christmas? And, she immediately texts me back. So even though they're far away, I feel like I can communicate frequently, and they usually FaceTime every Sunday. So I think that it's shrunk place a lot. But I also feel that in a way, it has isolated us more. Any thoughts? Yeah.
I kind of think that represents a different way of thinking about connection. One is this more, primal, emotional, human bonding versus a more rational control, just like you said, like kind of mechanistic thing. It kind of ties me to, Giddens have a similar kind of idea of technology, make time and space distancing, and he takes a more optimistic view in that, thinking that's a good thing. But a lot of the sociology theories of group saying that people do kind of crave for like face-to-face interaction, like interaction rituals, these type of things. So in the example that you just brought up, maybe that's the tension, right? From a utility, rational point of view, it does make it convenient, but there is something lost there, which is this, maybe it's like our evolutionary hardwired needs for human face-to-face interaction and physical proximity.
But are your communications with your family in Norway, are they face-to-face?
On FaceTime, they are, I see their faces, but
You can't hug them, you can't touch them, but it feels very similar to face-to-face communication, doesn't it?
Yes.
Maybe. I mean, I think we could all look at our last few years of Zoom and see that that's not the same experience as what we're having right now. You know,
Right.
there's the immediacy of the communication that you don't quite get in Zoom. Like there's this weird, you know, only one person can speak at a time sort of thing. And then there's the things that I don't know about, like pheromones and whatever else is going on in this room that connects us that can't be rendered on screen.
And if you get people actually laughing at the same time together on Zoom, you can't hear anything.
Yeah.
So you don't actually hear the timbre of everyone's laughter together.
Yeah.
I think that's a profound ritual.
Yes, like choirs tried to get together on Zoom and it didn't work.
When my now 18-year-old daughter was about 8, I had taught a course here in the department on dark sides of communication, that digital media communication, that I had used one of Sherry Turkle's articles. We read her book, we used an article on her, the concept of alone together. So I decided to start a dialogue with my daughter, turn into a game with her, that when we were out in public together, I would have her, if she could differentiate for me, and it'd be plausible, I mean, there's no gold standard, if she could tell me the difference between when people were together and had a digital device, and together but actually alone with their digital devices, she would get a little sticker thing, and she got 10 of those, she got an ice cream. So I was trying to see like through her eyes, like what was together and what was together but actually alone.
Interesting.
And to hear her, so I pointed out a couple of things, and then just when we were out, she would just talk to me, she was just narrating me what she perceived the difference, and it was not always what I would have seen, right? But it was really interesting to me because she got into it, it was a fun game for her, but also was very eye-opening for me of how she perceived, that elusive thing of like, when are people actually connecting relationally, and when are they just co-located, but in different worlds.
Interesting. Or, and some of the examples we've been talking about are almost kind of the opposite of that. They're not co-located, but they are in the same world.
Yeah, and she would have said that was actually together.
Together.
Yeah, she would have just
So
said that as
you are
together.
getting together with your family in Norway, even though you're not in the same place.
But we're still missing each other. So there is still that we're not really together because my mom will say, "Oh, I miss you so much. When are you coming home?" Even though we're right there talking to each other.
Interesting. All right. So I want to respect the time and leave a little bit of time at the end. So the second function is search and navigation. So for this one, obviously there was a lot about using GPS for finding your way and using Google to answer, every question, every dispute. Google knows the answer to that. But I actually chose for this to share a story from one of the immigrants who was talking about how he managed search and navigation prior to digital. So he says, I collected phone books from all the states and countries I traveled to. Anybody remember phone books? I used them for information, like they could help me get an idea of what the area is like. Whenever I went on vacation, the first thing I did is pick up a phone book and get some information about the place. Phone books are bulky and you have to spend a lot of time, and you can't just ask it a question. But it was a tool, a medium, a technology maybe, that was a way of getting information. Of course, people talked a lot about dictionaries and encyclopedias and all those kinds of physical tools that we used to have for getting information, or maps, the big fold-out maps, and how challenging they were, and how the digital technology shrinks them down to put them not only all in one place, but also able to be responsive to where I am. So I don't have to fold the map to find the right place to show me the streets between Ballard and UW, which actually is pretty easy, but because my phone will not only show it to me, but it'll talk to me. So I don't even have to look at it while I'm driving. It'll tell me where I need to go. So these two topics are huge, and we could spend a lot of time talking about your own experiences, but any thoughts, particularly about how they've changed our relationship to time and space around the way we search for information and navigate our way in the world?
Yes.
When I think of my own family, especially how we search for things or for help, I remember, in my parents' home, the sink broke or something, and my dad was like, I just don't have the expertise to be able to fix this, it's not in my wheelhouse. And I remember the shock on his face when I said, well, just Google it. And then he realized that he could look at tutorials on YouTube, and he was like, this is a game changer. So stuff like that. And then, he told my mom, he was like, she told me to look it up on Google, you should try this. And then and then that spread to them telling my grandparents. I'm like, oh my gosh, we can use the internet for this. So that was really interesting because I know if my mom needed help on something, her first thought was always I'll talk to my mom or my parents and see what they know. Whereas my first inclination is I'm just gonna look it up.
So I think that's a great example, and it reminded me of, I was in Rome, not lost without a GPS, but I was in Rome. I was actually there on a study abroad trip, and there was a clothes washer in my apartment, and I wanted to use it, and all the instructions were in Italian, and I was like, how am I going to figure this out? Well, Google knows. There's a little video shows me exactly what I need to do, because it was not intuitive to me, right? But that's what I want to come back to. How do you think it became intuitive for you to think about looking to Google for answers to things like that?
I think for me it was kind of just when I realized I was seeking information that those immediately around me didn't know. Mm-hmm. And then I think we also, when I was in elementary school or middle school, my school got computers, and so our teachers taught us media literacy, I guess. So here's how you log on to Explorer, and here's how you type it in. And so they taught us because I guess they foresaw that this was going to be something important.
So anybody have kids in school now? Do they still teach the basics of computer literacy in school, or do they just assume everybody knows it now? You may know? I don't know the answer to this. They teach basic media literacy? Things like...
I don't know if they teach how to use a computer, but they certainly teach how to be thoughtful about the sources of your information, right. Just basic media literacy. I think the librarians are on it. At least in my experience, it's the librarians who are tasked with that.
Okay. All right. Well,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I have younger cousins who are in school, and they just say that their teacher just tells them to this is how you type this word, but they know how to turn it on, they know how to do everything else. So it's are they teaching them anything? No. I feel like they're just telling them what to put into the computer so that they can do their tasks.
Yeah. So I almost hesitate to bring this up because we only have about 7 minutes left. But I think I actually I finished this book in January of 2022.
And, no, 2023. And so last January, a year ago. And I was wrapping it up in November when ChatGPT was introduced.
And so I felt like I had to at least mention it. I wasn't going to go back and redo interviews at that point, but at least think about it and what kind of impact it might have on some of the core ideas. I think the core ideas remain the same. That media has become integrated, that we use the same tools for everything, that some of the differences between technologies are no longer meaningful, that it's disrupted our sense of time and space, and I'm actually leaping into my conclusion. But I think that thinking about what's being taught in schools and this notion of fundamental how to make good decisions about what information is valid and what isn't, I think there's a huge amount of concern about that now with generative AI. And I think some of it's well placed, and I think some of it may be a little bit misplaced. I think that there's a lot of hype. And there is misuse. Taylor Swift would say it's not insignificant. But I'll just use a real quick example and then move on. My father, the physicist, I remember when, and my mother was a math teacher. So for me, studying communication was an act of rebellion, right? Especially qualitative work. And when handheld calculators, HP and Texas Instruments came out with their first handheld calculators in the early 70s, I guess. And there was a similar sort of hue and cry of students are going to completely, will never be able to understand how to do mathematics on their own, or arithmetic on their own, because they're just going to depend on the calculator. And my father's response was, no, so we need to just get rid of calculators. We need to throw them out of the classroom. We can't have them in the classroom. We need to teach students to do arithmetic in their heads. It's an important skill. They have to do it. And his response was, no, we don't need to get rid of them. What we need to do is think about how to help students understand when the calculator when they might have made a mistake, or when they may have, does the data make sense? Is this information I'm getting off the calculator logical? So it's not about doing a better job of memorizing the times tables. It's a better job at interpreting what we're getting from this, digitally assisted tool. And I think there's a core idea there that's similar with generative AI. The AI is able to do a whole lot more than calculate a square root, but I think the concept is similar. All right, I'm actually going to skip ahead. So commerce and commercials, we could talk about that one a whole long time, and that actually is sort of at the core of my academic background in advertising, but we don't have time for that. So let's just kind of go to the summary. I came up with 3 broad observations that worked their way through all of these different chapters that we were looking at. One of them is that, which we've already talked about, that the transition from pre-digital to digital communication has been incremental. And many of the people who are immigrants have seen multiple stages in that and been able to see the advantages and disadvantages of how we've been making this journey. Second, digital era, different forms and functions are experienced as different interfaces to a single medium rather than different media types. So we talk about apps and how we text and all those kinds of things. And then the third, and one that came up definitely in your introductions, was that it's become indispensable. And so the whole issue of media dependency is not new. It's been around for a long time. But with this particular technology, the dependency is just really deeply ingrained into everything that we do, all the way down to being able to pay for parking, right? And then I also identified 3 meta themes. One was related to identity and community versus individuality. My phone number is never going to change. It's a Tennessee area code, but it's my identity, right? I have to use my phone for dual authentication for all sorts of things, and that phone number is as much my identity as my social security number is, in a very frightening way. Whereas it used to be that a phone number was a family good, right? It was a phone number that belonged to the family. So, and there's multiple other examples of moving from sort of the community to the individual. Involvement, and this one is, it kind of works in multiple ways, but the sort of dichotomy is around value and ease. And so sometimes it's much easier for us to do things on this. It's much easier to use it for navigation than it is to use a map. But sometimes we place more value on things that are easier and sometimes not, but I'll just leave it there. And then finally, interactions, and here the dichotomy is around depth versus breadth. And you know, there is, you know, sort of infinite depth here, but in fact, a lot of what we do is very thin. So I'll stop there. I left 2 minutes. And I'll be happy to answer any final questions about anything except for how to fly an airplane, because it's been too long.
We have a couple minutes if there's questions. I think you did such a good job of integrating that people might have had their opportunity to ask. Yeah, please, Ron.
Actually, I do have a question.
Yeah.
Is the idea of digital immigration and immigrants still useful?
It's a good question.
May I just elaborate a little bit? Because, for example, when we talk about AI technology, I'm already in my 30s, and now I have generated AI. Am I an AI immigrant or native? And I can think about in future there will be new technology if we assume there is a linear growth. So how can we? My point is very pragmatic. How can I cite your work and the work related to digital immigration in my study of ICT and make it relevant?
Yeah. Good question. I think the value is less in, there will come a time when there are no people alive who remember not having one of these. So from that perspective, there is, the concept may be somewhat dated and may not last very long. But I think the big takeaways are that no matter how technology evolves and the ways that we communicate evolve, people who've had less exposure to that, whether it be because of generational differences, than those who don't, approach them in different ways. And I think that's maybe where the value lies, in understanding how something that might be very intuitive for one sort of group of people may be not so intuitive for another group of people. So from a pragmatic perspective, and if you're trying to think about developing communication technologies that are going to be, optimal, you want to think about don't assume that everyone grew up drooling over one of these, right?
Yes.
Do you think the synthesis is permanent? Like, obviously, like, all our phones can break, and we can go back. But do you think that it's possible to pull back from synthesis without just regressing technology? Like, can we imagine living in a digital world that's not synthesized into the smartphone, or is the smartphone
I given what I've seen, and this gets back to the incrementalism, which was one of my points. I think that we're still at an incremental stage. I mean, Elon Musk has embedded a chip, so so I think this is an incremental technology. But I think the synthesis, the core idea, I think that we're not going to want to go back to having separate devices for everything. Why would you? Right? Record players are big, they're clunky. And I know LPs are making a comeback, but that's a flash in the pan. All right.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.